James Sutton. This is Road to Recovery. Today, my special guest is Major Neill Franklin. Welcome, Neill.
James, thanks for inviting me to the show.
It's great to have you here. Can you tell us a little bit about your organization?
Sure, James. The Law Enforcement Action Partnership began in 2002 by two police officers, one from New Jersey and one from New York, a lieutenant and a captain, who recognized that we had a significant problem in our country regarding how we're approaching this issue of addiction, how we're approaching drugs and the availability of drugs in this country. And they realized that the war on drugs basically has failed and that it really never could work because it's really about a war on people who are addicted to various drugs. So they started the organization, which is primarily of criminal justice professionals, volunteers.
Okay.
So we're talking about police, prosecutors, judges, corrections officials, anyone who we consider to have been on the front lines of the so-called war on drugs. And we're primarily a speakers bureau. We're international. We're in Canada, we're in Europe. We have a very strong branch in Europe, headquartered in the United Kingdom, Australia, South America.
Wow.
But we're headquartered here in the United States because we know that, for the most part, the United States tends to be a leader in a number of things. And obviously, we have the most significant problem with drug use in this country. When you look at us compared to the other countries around the globe.
Right.
When it comes to incarceration, we have the highest rate of incarceration on the planet.
Yes.
And we know through our work and our research that's directly related to us fighting the war on drugs from a criminal justice perspective instead of from a health perspective. And so, to be short, we have 5 silos of work. The first one is police-community relations, as we try to improve the relationships between police and community. Again, directly related to the war on drugs. The second is incarceration, which I just briefly spoke to, and the problems that we have with the high rate of incarceration in the United States. Where we're 5% of the world's population here, but yet we have 25% of the world's prisoners in the land of the free. Next, we have drug policy. And that could be anything from harm reduction to addiction, as we're talking about here today,
Right.
to the various drugs that are out there and so on. And then the last is global issues. So there are different things regarding human rights is one of the global issues that we focus on from around the globe. And we have these wonderful volunteer speakers. We have thousands upon thousands of members. But we have a very core select group of about 250 men and women, criminal justice professionals who speak as experts on these topics.
Wow, that's fantastic. Now, what's been your experience? Have you got pushback from other police officers and other prosecutors? I mean, is this catching or is it a lot of pushback to you guys? I mean, because you were one day you were a narcotics agent, you know, and you were carrying a gun, you were a major with state troopers, and the next thing you're talking about is that it's not working.
Yeah, so let me give you a little bit of background because I think it's important. I'm a retired major from the Maryland State Police.
Right.
And most of my career was either in narcotics enforcement. I worked undercover. I commanded multi-jurisdictional task forces. I had 9 task forces at one time when I was the regional commander for the Northeast region for the state of Maryland. And, you know, I was the head of training for 2 years. And then I was recruited by Baltimore City upon my retirement from the Maryland State Police to head up their training division from 2000 to 2004. And then the last police agency of my 34-year career was Maryland Transit. Again, where I was the head of the detective bureau and we did extensive work in the war on drugs, as I might say, and fighting that. And so now you might, as you're saying, as your question was,
how did you get here?
How do I get here? And for me, unfortunately, it was a tragic situation where a very good friend of mine, Ed Totley, who was an undercover agent for the Maryland State Police, he was killed doing an undercover drug buy not very far from where we sit right here today.
Wow.
It was in Tacoma Park, right on the border of D.C. and he was buying cocaine from a mid-level drug dealer, and he was murdered by that drug dealer back in 2000. So it made me start really taking a critical look at our approach to dealing with drug use and addiction in this country, where we had been fighting this with criminal justice. Let me put it this way. Where else do we use a criminal justice approach on a public health issue? I can't think of any public health issue other than addiction to drugs where we use a criminal justice approach to deal with it. Right. And that's what I came to recognize, and I stumbled across the Law Enforcement Action Partnership website, LEAP website, and I joined up with Jack Cole and Peter Criss, the original founders of the organization. And as I started pushing against how we were going after the war on drugs, yes, I started getting a lot of flack, a lot of pushback from my law enforcement peers.
I would imagine, yeah.
I had put myself into a position to learn about this issue from a completely different perspective. And in the policing world, we very seldom have an opportunity to step out of our policing boots and look at something from a different perspective, because we're out there day after day, hour after hour, month after month, moving in a particular direction to deal with an issue. Right. And that's handcuffs, that's jails, that's putting people behind bars for various things. And I was given that opportunity. And now I see this issue of drug use from many different perspectives.
Okay. Now, I read a little bit of material about you, and it kind of mentioned Kirk Smoke. And Kirk Smoke was one of the first major leaders in the country that I heard talking about decriminalization. This was like years and years and years ago when he was the mayor of Baltimore. And I'm saying, like, how can you decriminalize drugs? At the time, I didn't even understand what he was talking about. Yeah. And evidently, you and him were like minds because you did something with him.
Yeah. Do you know why he developed that perspective?
No.
So I just told you my story, right?
Tell me.
He was a prosecutor in Baltimore before he was the mayor. And back in the early 80s, there was this young detective for the Baltimore Police Department, Marcellus Ward, call him Marty. And like Ed Totley, my friend who I told you about,
yes.
Marty Ward was working a drug buy in an apartment in Baltimore City. Things went wrong. Make a long story short, things went wrong, and he was killed doing that undercover drug buy in Baltimore City. Kurt Schmoke, as the prosecutor, had to listen, as they went to prosecute the guy that killed him, he had to listen to the audio recording of Marty being shot.
Wow.
And then expiring after that. And he started to take a critical look then of what we were doing. He was like, oh, time out for a second. This issue of drug prohibition is causing the violence in my city, in Baltimore. The gangs, the crews on the street corners fighting one another for territory. Us, the police, having to put in undercover agents to go in and make these buys and put ourselves in danger.
Right.
And he said, let's time out for a second. Then, of course, he eventually became mayor. And when he became mayor, he's now dealing with a very high rate of HIV and AIDS from intravenous drug use. Mm-hmm. And again, it's because we are not, we had not taken a critical focus of dealing with this issue from a health perspective.
Right.
So that's when him and his healthcare director, Dr. Peter Billinson, started a needle exchange program in Baltimore.
Wow.
And then Mayor Schmoke, he went to Congress and he was at one of these major meetings of mayors from around the country. And he said, look, we need to take a critical look at this and think about decriminalizing drug use and, how we can eliminate the violence and how we can provide services to people. His needle exchange program was one of the most dramatic HIV and AIDS reduction turnarounds across this country, where the numbers went from the roof into the basement over a matter of years.
Great. I didn't know that story. Now, let me ask you this, because in some communities, that can be the major industry. You know,
Yeah.
that's the mate, because there's lack of resources in terms of factories or job opportunities in some industries. So when you decriminalize marijuana, for instance, a lot of the employment is removed from the community. What can the business community, is there something that the greater society can do to shore that up?
Yeah. A lot of people don't think of what you just said there, James. And let me begin with first saying that, because I'm an advocate for a regulated market for marijuana.
Okay.
I advocate for that, and this is why.
Well, let me cut you off. What does that mean?
So what is a regulated market? Some people say legalization, but regulation and control, because when you prohibit something, you, the government, the people, give up all control. You turn over all control of that substance to criminals, to organized crime, the cartels, the neighborhood gangs and crews, when you prohibit it.
Right.
But when you regulate it, you now put things and measures in place to control it, to do a better job of keeping it out of the hands of our kids than what gang members and cartel members do.
Right, right.
Because they hire kids to do it. But so this economic piece that you're talking about here, in a city like Baltimore, where not only are jobs scarce in some neighborhoods, but a lot of the people have criminal records, and no one's hiring them.
Right.
And their criminal records, most of those criminal records are for nonviolent crimes of drug possession and drug use.
Right.
Now, I was on a radio show a few years ago, about 6 years ago, and we were beginning to work in Maryland on moving to a regulated market for marijuana. And this young lady calls into the radio show, and she asks a question. She says, well, first of all, she says, I don't agree with you establishing a regulated market and legalizing marijuana. And I thought she was going to come at this from a health perspective, from a youth perspective mainly.
Right.
And as I started to talk, she said, no, you don't understand me. She says, if it becomes legal and big companies start setting up the dispensaries in the stores, what are we going to do for money? And when she meant we, she meant those people, her friends in her community. What are we going to do for money? She says, a large portion of the money that is used in our neighborhood for buying school clothes, paying the rent,
Right.
keeping the heat and the lights on,
Right.
comes from selling marijuana on the street corners. And when I thought about it, I realized something, that the largest single employer in Baltimore City was not Walmart, okay? It wasn't any of these other superstores. The largest single employer in Baltimore was the drug trade.
Wow.
So what would happen as we are moving into a regulated market for marijuana all across this country?
Yes.
What economically is going to happen if we don't create a pathway for people, black people, poor people, brown people, who are currently making money on the illicit side of this, if we don't make a pathway for them to make money on the legal, regulated side of it?
Right.
That's a big problem economically, because it's not a new industry. It is a billion-dollar industry already, but it's illicit and underground. Mm-hmm. It's not a new industry. It's just changing hands right now. Mm-hmm. From the street corner to the boardroom. And we've got to create those opportunities. And again, I don't agree. I don't smoke marijuana. I don't plan on smoking marijuana. I have learned a lot regarding health benefits when it's used properly and processed properly. Mm-hmm. And I do recognize that we need continued serious research
Right.
to figure out where do we go and how do we get there for medicinal benefits.
Right.
But I do believe that we need a regulated market so that we can bring it under the law and into a place of control by the people, not organized crime and not the cartels.
Right. Yeah, we've had Eric Sterling, and he worked on the committee for the developing the dispensaries and the laws and everything. He spoke a little bit about that when he talked about policy here. Now, what happened with alcohol? Do you know anything about the history? How, when we went from prohibition to with the alcohol, what was the outcome with that?
Let me just say something that despite how many people die from alcohol intoxication every year, and the tons of problems that we have with alcohol addiction, I can guarantee you one thing: this country will never ever revisit alcohol prohibition. And the violence and the gangs, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Bugsy Siegel, Al Capone, and all those gangsters that were created, the enormous cost. And during those 13 years of alcohol prohibition, people still drank their, until it was coming out of their ears.
Of gin.
We had more underground speakeasies than we had bars before alcohol prohibition. Right, the bathtub gin, people going blind, kids being recruited by bootleggers to sell it and run it. We'll never return to that. But when we decided to repeal the 18th Amendment and end alcohol prohibition, it moved back into the regulated market.
Okay.
To where when people now buy alcohol, they know that wine is probably somewhere around 18%. Well, it's actually on the bottle, 18% alcohol.
Yeah, it's regulated, right.
Whether it's 80 proof or 60 proof or 100 proof, some of your strong rum, you know what you're getting and what you're drinking. It's, and we're educating people about responsible use. It's although it's not a perfect world with alcohol, it's much better than the days of alcohol prohibition. And I don't think anyone, I've yet to meet anyone that would argue, different.
And let me ask you this. In Montgomery County, we have a liquor it's controlled. We control the liquor. So, and also advertising.
Yeah.
And I noticed I'm from D.C., right? And in D.C., it's a liquor store almost on every corner. And I don't know about today because I'm not living there now, but we used to have big signs to smoke cigarettes and buy liquor right there where we live, right? In Montgomery County, the leadership has been wise enough, and the voters have been wise enough to eliminate a lot of those problems in terms of the saturation of stores, the availability and advertising, and even to regulate even new products. Because when I was on the Alcohol and Other Drug Advisory Committee, sometimes we would get stuff like vodka lollipops, that people wanted to bring vodka lollipops and drinks that looked like sodas into Montgomery County, and we refused to have it come in because it was very attractive to children. So it was very attractive to get a new market started early, right? So Montgomery County has been pretty good with, being aware of how advertising in certain communities and availability can cause problems.
I like what you just said about that, because we've got 50 states in the union. Each one of them has a different alcohol regulation policy.
Right.
I don't know if any that are exactly the same. But one of the things that we've done as an organization, as we're seeing the regulated market come up for medical marijuana and cannabis, and now the adult use market in a number of states, one of the things that we do, we go to conferences where business owners, people who are getting into the business of marijuana, are going to these conferences to learn about it, and to learn how to set up their businesses. And we're speaking on various things, but one of the things I want to touch on that we're speaking about is advertising, right? We're like, all right, folks, time out. We're moving this market from the illicit, from the street corners to the boardroom under regulation. Let's be wise. We don't need gummy bears. We don't need lollipops. the packaging, make it as plain as possible.
Okay.
You know, you don't have to have all these fancy colors, and people know what it is, right? Adults know what it is. Let's be very reasonable so that we're not attracting young people, kids, to these products.
Let me hold your point right there. We're going to have to take a station break.
Absolutely.
But we're going to come right back with that, right where we're leaving you right now, right?
Okay.
So this is James Sutton, my guest today, Major Neill Franklin, and we'll be right back with the Road to Recovery.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth.
Welcome back to Road to Recovery. My guest today, Major Neill Franklin, and we're back. So did you want to finish your point? Or?
Yeah, just real quick. I just want to say that this is about regulation, right? And this is where we can really make a difference in how we educate and how we control the products that we move from a place of illegality to a place of legality for adult use, right?
Right.
So advertising, time use restrictions, age restrictions, those types of things. Social control and social influence. Just think about what we've done with tobacco use over the past few decades.
Yeah, huge.
Down dramatically.
Yeah, a lot.
And it's not about prohibiting tobacco use, right? It's about education. It's about time use, you know, restrictions. You can't smoke in here anymore. You got to go outside in the cold, in the snow, around the corner. Don't stand by the door.
Right.
So that's how we need to do it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Now, you wanted to talk about mental health.
Yeah.
So what aspects of mental health do you feel important to share with the audience today?
I think we started really losing our battle against addiction when we turned away from a critical mental health focus in this country. You and I were talking earlier about back in the 80s when we started closing mental hospitals due to funding being pulled back from the federal government.
Right.
And how many of those people were let out into the streets, into the communities from which they came, and our homeless population just started to grow.
Yeah.
Enormous growth. And today we have a significant problem with our homeless population. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that everyone who's homeless has a mental health issue. Some people have just fallen on bad times. But we all know that many of our homeless are dealing with a serious mental health issue.
Yes.
Many of them are dealing with the duality of mental health and substance abuse,
Right.
Be it drugs, be it alcohol, and be it some other things. When we look at whether we're talking about our veterans, whether we're talking about law enforcement folks, whether we're talking about kids within our own neighborhoods and PTSD. You know, in Baltimore, where I grew up and where I'm from, where I live now, young people have serious issues with PTSD.
Okay.
The violence within their communities, right outside their front doors, and in many cases, inside their homes. If we don't do something about this mental health issue and the foundation of the mental health issue, which is the trauma that people are experiencing, whether it's a war campaign, whether it's a police officer on violent streets, and most importantly, the kids within our communities who are witnessing this violence, and many of them are victims of this violence, and they turn to self-medication because they don't know how to mitigate what has happened to them or process what has happened to them.
Right.
So we need to provide serious and make available serious mental health services within our communities. If we really want to affect addiction in a positive way and reduce those numbers, we've got to deal with mental health.
Right. So what is your organization? It says murder. What was that about? You do some nonprofit stuff with a group in Baltimore or somebody?
We do nonprofit work with any organization that wants to work with us.
Oh, okay.
With any organization, whether you're dealing with recidivism, whether you're returning citizens from being incarcerated, whether you're veterans, whether you're from the left or the right, right on crime, which was born out of Texas. I mean, you name it. If you're about criminal justice reform, if you're about working on resolving addiction and mental health issues, if you're about any of this, and please go to our website, lawenforcementaction.org, and look at
Okay.
those 5 silos of work. And I guarantee you'll find something that you're very passionate about there. And we welcome you to come work with us on it.
And we certainly will. And thank you so much for having you. So we got about a minute left. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you might want to shout out and share with the
There's probably
audience?
about 4,000 or 5,000 things that we didn't cover that.
We'll have you back. We'll have you back.
I would love to come back, and again, thank you for this show. But I just want people to do a good job in educating themselves in 2 books real quick I'll recommend.
Yeah, great.
Number 1 is Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari.
Oh, yeah.
And the second one is In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts by Dr. Gabor Mate. Learn about addiction and what can be done about it.
Yes, right. And I read one of them in the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, because that's where I became aware of a lot of the Canada issues.
Absolutely.
And then I was at the training where I met you. I met the lady that actually worked with him.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that was very, very encouraging. I learned a lot from Impact, you know. Yeah. So my guest today has been Major Neill Franklin, who's a great law enforcement ally to the recovery community. My name is James Sutton, and we'll see you on the road to recovery.